No fake documents, no unlawful behavior, yet a 73-year-old black woman was still shoved to the ground by police in the middle of a bank just because of her skin color and a so-called suspicious alert. One officer ripped the bag from her hands, a photo of her son in military uniform fell to the floor, and the man sneered with contempt. "Looks like some washed-up rapper." Blood trickled from her lip, but his smile stayed cold as stone. What he didn't know was that his actions wouldn't just draw blood from her, but from an entire system, because the woman he dismissed so easily was the mother of a legendary Green Beret. What punishment waits for those who believe they have the right to crush others simply because they assume no one will ever fight back? Watch until the end for the answer. On a Tuesday morning, layered in frost, the city of Milway moved like an old clock, predictable, slow, and indifferent. Inside the glass doors of Milway National Bank, the warm air hit Evelyn Brooks like a soft slap, unwelcome and artificial. She was 73, small in frame, her skin the color of rich, unpolished mahogany. Her purple wool sweater, stretched and pilled at the elbows, did little to hide the tremble in her hands as she clutched a tan envelope, creases sharp from being held too tightly. The bank's polished floor reflected fluorescent light in sharp shards. The walls were pale and clean, the silence sterile. She took a step forward, her orthopedic shoes barely making a sound. Behind the counter, Clara adjusted her seat with a click. Blonde, brisk, and likely no older than 26, Clara didn't greet Evelyn. Her eyes skimmed from the gray wool hat perched awkwardly on Evelyn's head down to the taped corner of the envelope she held. Then, she leaned slightly back, not enough to startle, but enough to signal. Evelyn approached, resting one gloved hand on the edge of the counter. "Good morning," she said, her voice a warm rasp. Clara didn't answer. Instead, she tilted her head and glanced at the envelope. "What can I help you with?" she asked, the tone not openly hostile, but clipped, as if time was already being wasted. "I'd like to deposit this check. It's from my retirement fund." Clara didn't reach for the envelope. "May I see some identification?" she asked, her words falling with the weight of suspicion, not procedure. Evelyn nodded, gently pulling her wallet from a small black handbag. The wallet creaked when she opened it, the leather worn thin at the seams. She took out a driver's license and an old Social Security card and placed them alongside the check on the counter, arranging them with care. Clara barely glanced at them before lifting her gaze. "You sure you're the account holder?" she asked, her voice smooth but lined with something cold. The phrase didn't land like a question, it was a challenge. Evelyn blinked slowly, the corner of her mouth twitching once in restraint. "Yes," she replied simply. Clara gave a tight nod, picked up the documents between two fingers like they were moist, and began typing. A moment later she froze, her eyes locked on the screen. Then her lips parted just enough to release a sentence designed not to inform, but to announce, "We'll have to verify this. The amount is not small." There was a flicker in the air, like something had shifted, but no one wanted to name it. A man in line behind Evelyn, mid-50s, flannel shirt, tired eyes, gave a short laugh, barely audible, but he didn't whisper. "People like her don't usually walk in here with that kind of money," he muttered, just loud enough. Clara didn't look up. Evelyn did not turn. Her fingers moved to the lapel of her coat, found a small pocket sewn into the lining. She opened it, retrieving a pill bottle with a prescription label that had faded to near illegibility. She twisted it open with the kind of care reserved for sacred things, popped a small white tablet onto her tongue and swallowed. Her movements were mechanical, smooth, familiar, and rehearsed. No one offered her a seat. She stood in silence. The room did not. A tension thickened like steam in a bathroom with no window. People avoided looking at her directly, as though her stillness was accusatory. A teller 2 desks down paused, then returned to her monitor. Clara tapped at her keyboard, a little harder than necessary. Evelyn adjusted her stance, switching weight to her left leg. She didn't fidget. She didn't sigh. The only sound she made was the softest rasp of breath through her nose. Her eyes, dark and bright at once, didn't blink much. They just watched Clara. There was a difference between patience and endurance. Evelyn had long since passed one and settled into the other. Another 2 minutes passed. The printer came to life behind the counter. Clara stood, walked briskly toward it, collected a single printed sheet and returned. She still hadn't met Evelyn's gaze. When she handed the paper back across the counter, her fingertips brushed Evelyn's glove. She flinched, almost imperceptibly, but enough. And when she finally spoke again, her voice was soft, professional. "We'll have to make a copy of your ID. Please wait here." Evelyn nodded once. Clara left the counter, her heels sharp against the linoleum. The man behind Evelyn clicked his tongue. "She's probably laundering money. You see what they wear, but not what they hide." Evelyn didn't move. She stared straight ahead at the window behind the teller's booth, where the morning frost had left streaks like veins on glass. Her lips parted slightly as she inhaled. Not a single person in the bank told the man to be quiet. Not a single person turned to offer her their place in line. What happened next was nothing, absolutely nothing. Just the buzz of fluorescent lights and the quiet hum of banking machines. But in that nothing, Evelyn stood. No words, no protest, only the subtle weight of someone who had spent a lifetime being looked at without being seen. The minutes ticked by, though in Evelyn's world they moved differently. Drawn out, dragged like heavy feet through cold molasses. Her fingers, though gloved, had begun to tingle from poor circulation, but she didn't remove them. She wouldn't give the room that image of an old woman fumbling, appearing small. She had been many things in her life, but never small by choice. From the back office, Clara returned with a thin smile that failed to meet her eyes. "There's just one more form I'll need you to sign," she said, unfolding a paper with too many blank lines and small boxes. She placed it down and slid a pen across the counter, deliberately not touching Evelyn's hand. The form wasn't complicated, just unnecessary. A redundant verification for large deposits from senior clients. As if age and wealth could not coexist without suspicion. Evelyn didn't ask why. She read the document with slow diligence, not because she didn't understand, but because she refused to be hurried. Behind her, the line had grown. Someone sighed, annoyed. The man in the flannel shirt shifted his weight again. "You'd think people would do this stuff online if they had the brain for it," he said, loud enough now to invite a response. No one gave him one. Clara's patience thinned visibly. She didn't frown or tap her foot, but the rhythm in her shoulders stiffened. "You can take the form home if it's too much," she offered, the condescension wrapped in a customer service cadence. "Just mail it back in." "I'll sign it here," Evelyn replied, voice even. She took the pen with fingers that still bore the slight tremor. The letters came slowly but clearly, written with the kind of pride born from having signed much more important things in the past. Marriage licenses, school permissions, deployment consents. When she handed the form back, Clara gave a tight nod. "We'll need to hold the deposit for verification. Standard policy." It wasn't standard, and both of them knew it. But Evelyn said nothing. She simply nodded, then reached into her coat one last time to retrieve a folded piece of paper, the original notice from the pension board confirming the disbursement. She laid it gently next to the check. Another layer of proof, though unnecessary. Her body language said, "I came prepared. I expected this." Clara didn't thank her. She took the paper and turned away. Across the lobby, a young couple entered, laughing softly, holding hands. They walked past Evelyn without seeing her, their joy untouched by the silence she carried. Their laughter felt louder in the context of the stillness, like a reminder that for some people, the world still moved easily. The printer groaned again, spitting out another sheet of confirmation. Clara retrieved it, stapled it with a snap, and returned. "Here's your receipt. You'll get a call if there are any issues," she said. Then, with an afterthought that barely passed for courtesy, she added, "Thank you for banking with us." Evelyn took the receipt, folded it once, then again. Her hands moved slowly, deliberately, as if every crease in the paper bore witness. She placed it into her handbag, pulled the zipper closed, and turned to leave. She did not say goodbye. As she walked past the man who had mocked her earlier, he stepped slightly to the side, not out of politeness, but out of a discomfort he couldn't name. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. Outside, the cold wind rushed up to greet her, more honest than anything inside the bank. She pulled her coat tighter, not to shield from the chill, but to hold something in. Dignity, maybe, or the echoes of yet another morning where existing meant defending oneself from doubt. She moved slowly down the steps, careful on each one. Her breath showed in white bursts, her back straight. A woman on the sidewalk paused briefly, glanced up, then looked away. There were no protests, no outbursts, no visible scars from the morning's transaction, but the silence Evelyn carried was not weakness. It was a silence that had learned to absorb, to catalog, to endure. It was the kind of silence that changes nothing in the moment, but alters everything in the long run. And though no one in the bank noticed, no one followed her out, and no one offered help, the day had already begun to shift. Not because she raised her voice, but because she didn't have to. The door hadn't even finished closing behind Evelyn when it opened again, harder this time, as though the chill outside had shoved something cruel through it. 2 officers entered, white, uniformed, and stiff with authority. They didn't pause, didn't glance around, didn't ask questions. The first man's eyes zeroed in on her like a target he'd hit before. The second's hand twitched near his belt, not from threat, but habit. Less than 20 seconds had passed since they arrived, and already their presence was too loud to be lawful. Without a word, the taller one lunged forward and yanked the black handbag from Evelyn's shoulder. The sudden force sent her body twisting just enough to stagger her balance. The clasp tore open, and the contents spilled like unwanted secrets across the pristine tile floor. Receipts, folded letters, a half-empty pill bottle. One officer barked a laugh that didn't match his mouth. The other crouched, not to help, but to dig. His fingers brushed past her identification and found a photograph. A sun-faded, yellowed image of a young black man in a military uniform. Metals glinting faintly even in the paper's age. The officer let out a snort of breath through his nose, mocking. "Looks more like a rapper than a soldier." His thumb smudged the corner of the photograph. He held it up between 2 fingers, showing it to his partner as if it were contraband. Evelyn didn't snatch it back. She didn't speak. She sat upright, back straight, hands clenched over her knees like coiled springs. Her mouth did not open to defend, deny, or demand. Her eyes, however, burned with memory. Then came the push. Casual, deliberate, not a shove but an insult wearing the mask of motion. The taller officer leaned in and drove a forearm against her shoulder. She rocked back, hitting the edge of the desk. The sound was dull, but the outcome wasn't. Her jaw knocked against the wood, and in a single flash of breath, blood painted the inside of her lip. She did not cry out. The room responded with silence. Not the respectful kind, but the complicit kind. Clara turned away, typing without seeing. The man in the flannel shirt averted his gaze, suddenly fascinated with the tiled floor. The couple who had once laughed near the entrance edged toward the exit. Nobody moved to help. Nobody even whispered. Evelyn steadied herself. Her hand found the edge of the desk, fingers slipping slightly on the polished surface. She exhaled once through her nose and straightened. Blood now drying like a secret in the corner of her mouth. She knelt, not hurried, not frantic, and began gathering the scattered papers with the steadiness of someone who had done this before. The officer stepped forward again, not with urgency, but with a kind of performance. His boot found the last remaining document on the floor, her government ID, and rested on it, not crushing it, just enough to make retrieval an act of humiliation. "Go on," he said. "Pick it up." She did not look at him. Instead, she moved closer, eyes fixed on the floor. Her hand reached forward, hesitating only to shift the toe of his boot aside without touching him. The motion was slow, purposeful. not submissive, but restrained. Her fingers closed around the ID, lifting it like a fragile truth from beneath the weight of contempt. The officer smirked. "You know, if you didn't have anything to hide, you wouldn't act so nervous." Evelyn rose slowly. Her back crackled softly under the strain, but her composure never faltered. Her silence was no longer mere patience. It had become defiance through restraint. Every movement screamed of history, of sidewalks too cautiously, of bags clutched tightly, of endless justifications to people who never earned them. Behind the counter, Clara busied herself with tasks that did not exist. Her screen blinked an empty spreadsheet. Her fingers moved, but her face flushed pale. Even she could feel it now. The wrongness in the air had become too thick to ignore, but too convenient to interrupt. The other officer tucked the photograph into the breast pocket of his uniform without asking. Evelyn saw it, but said nothing. Her tongue pressed against the cut inside her mouth, the iron tang of blood grounding her. A voice inside her urged a response, but she held it down, wrapped it tight, and stored it away. Not yet. One of the customers shifted uncomfortably, then turned their body slightly, as though angling away would make the scene vanish. The flannel-shirted man who had mocked her earlier now looked down, embarrassed not by his comment, but by being part of a moment no longer anonymous. The officers didn't apologize. They didn't explain. They didn't even seem to acknowledge what they'd done. Theirs was a power shaped not by law, but by habit, a muscle so frequently flexed it no longer required thought, and in that moment, they weren't afraid. Why would they be? The room had already shown them its spine, or lack thereof. Evelyn stood alone in a space filled with people, and none of them stood with her. Her lip continued to bleed in silence. Her hands, now gathering the last of her receipts, trembled only slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of remembering all the other times she had been expected to kneel for a system that could not kneel for her. No tears came, not because she was strong, but because tears had become a currency too costly to spend here. Her dignity, though bruised, remained unscathed. She would carry it out the door as she had carried so many things before, quietly, with no one bothering to ask what it had cost. The taller officer adjusted his belt, as if the moment required a pause, a pose, a performance of dominance. "You people are always so sensitive," he muttered, directing the comment not just at Evelyn but at the air around her, daring anyone to contradict him. No one did. His words hung like smoke, thin, toxic, and undeniably real. Evelyn remained still. Her breathing was shallow but controlled, a rhythm she had taught herself long ago. In, out, survive. The bank's security guard, stationed by the entrance, stood frozen. He was a part-timer, barely older than Clara, and his eyes darted between the officers and the front door, calculating nothing but his safety. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He wasn't there to protect people like Evelyn, not really. Clara, seated behind the polished counter, finally looked up. Her face carried an expression that tried to be neutral, but neutrality was cowardice in contexts like this. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed again. She knew the rules, knew who held power, knew who was expected to shut up and file things away. The officer with the photo leaned in, close enough that Evelyn could smell the synthetic cologne beneath his badge. "Bet he never told you to keep your mouth shut, huh?" he whispered, tossing the insult like a coin flipped for fun. She didn't react, not with a flinch, not with a sigh. Her silence sliced cleaner than words could have. It unsettled him that she did not try to fight back, that she did not beg for a scrap of dignity, that she simply endured. The second officer tapped his boot again against the tiled floor, impatient now, frustrated by the absence of spectacle. There were no raised voices, no resistance, no breakdown, and without drama, their power felt wasted. "Let's go," he barked. "She's being detained until we sort this out. No handcuffs yet, no Miranda rights, just a declaration thrown out like trash, casually, unjust. A paperclip clinked onto the floor as Clara's hand slipped. A small sound, but in the sterile silence, it echoed. The young teller's knuckles whitened as she tried not to make eye contact. Evelyn straightened once more, lifting her chin a fraction, just enough to suggest that while they had control of the moment, they would never own her name. As the officers positioned themselves on either side of her, the taller one grabbed her arm, not forcefully, but with the kind of pressure meant to remind her what she was not allowed to forget. Evelyn walked with them, steady as her bag swung loosely from the officer's other hand. Its contents, hastily stuffed back in, rattled with every step like the bones of old memories. They marched her through the bank's lobby, passing the same faces who had watched her be shamed and who now pretended they had seen nothing. A woman with red lipstick clutched her purse tighter. An old man at the ATM turned his back completely. The silence grew louder with every step she took. At the glass exit, Evelyn paused briefly. The winter sunlight glared across the sidewalk, dazzling and indifferent. Behind her, the door clicked closed. She did not look back. There was nothing behind her worth carrying forward. No apology, no acknowledgement, no outrage. Outside, the wind pressed against her cheeks like a slap in reverse. The officers moved faster now, guiding her toward a cruiser idling at the curb. The city didn't stop. No one screamed. No one recorded. No one asked. She had swallowed the metallic sting of blood and humiliation in equal measure. She would not spit it out. She would not grant them that image. Instead, she held it in her mouth like a bitter prayer, waiting to be answered. They opened the car door. She ducked slightly, entering with the grace of someone used to indignity, but unwilling to let it bend her spine. Inside the cruiser, the air was warm and stale. The vinyl seat stuck slightly to her coat. Through the window, she watched the bank fade behind her. Her heart beat steadily. Not from calm, but from control. Years of learning not to show the tremors. The officer in the front chuckled once, almost to himself. "Can you believe this?" he said to his partner. "All that drama over a few sheets of paper and a fake story." His words weren't meant for her, but he wanted her to hear them. That was the point. She said nothing, because what she carried with her wasn't fear. It was a memory. It was the imprint of the moment on the souls of everyone who had stood by, and it was the silent knowledge that some debts do not go unpaid forever. The cruiser door slammed shut behind her like a verdict, final and echoing in its indifference. The seatbelt was never offered. The cuffs around her wrists bit into the skin with a quiet insistence, metal against age. Evelyn Brooks sat between silence and insult, her breath shallow but steady, her eyes unmoved. Through the blurred window, Milway drifted past, gray, cold, and forgettable, but Evelyn was not. Inside the vehicle, the two officers shared a smirk, the kind forged from repetition, the kind that grew where accountability should have lived. One of them, the one with the habit of sneering without needing a reason, glanced into the rearview mirror. "You all right back there, Grandma?" he asked, the words twisted with false concern. Evelyn didn't answer. She didn't blink. Her power was not in the volume of her voice, but in the certainty of her presence. Moments passed before she spoke, just one sentence. Her voice was roughened by age but clear. "Let me call my son." The tone wasn't a plea. It was a statement, a deliberate pause in the flow of their theater. The driver let out a chuckle that cracked against the windshield like hail. "Your son? What, you need him to remind you of your meds?" His partner leaned back slightly, entertained. "Or maybe call the nursing home, see if they've got her evening pudding ready." Still, she didn't flinch. She repeated the words, slower this time. "Let me call my son." The silence that followed was different now, not empty, but edged. They handed her the phone with the casual arrogance of men convinced of their safety, men who thought that any call she made would be a whimper, not a warning. Evelyn's fingers, still cuffed, maneuvered the phone with practiced precision. One number, one contact, no hesitation. The call rang once, then connected. The voice on the other end was low, resonant, and immediately alert. "Mom?" She closed her eyes just for a second. "They've taken me," she said. "I'm all right. Don't get angry. Don't come running. Just No." The silence on the other end vibrated with tension, like a string pulled taut. The officers waited, amused. One nudged the other, grinning. "That's your DJ's son?" he snorted. "Tell him the set's canceled tonight." Then came the laugh, loud, crude, full of teeth. The driver snatched the phone from her hand and pressed the end call button with his thumb, like he was stamping out a cigarette. "Jesus," he muttered. "She's serious." Evelyn turned her head, just enough to face them. Her eyes weren't teary. They weren't even angry. They were steel. Forged, not born. She said nothing, but her silence was no longer passive. It was a prophecy. They didn't know. They couldn't. What she'd just done was not an act of desperation. It was a declaration. That call was not a cry for help. It was a trigger, not the kind you pull, the kind you regret never seeing in time. The cruiser eased into a turn, and for a brief moment the late morning sun slid across Evelyn's face like a spotlight with no applause. She blinked once, then stared straight ahead. Her lips didn't move again. She had said all she needed to say. Behind the wheel, the officers settled back into routine. Radio chatter, mindless small talk, jokes that didn't need to be funny to be cruel. But something shifted, not in the car, not in the street, in the silence. It was too calm now, too quiet, like the moment before a forest fire consumes everything. Evelyn leaned her head gently against the window, her breath fogging a small circle of glass. Outside, the sidewalks blurred by, and she watched the city turn away from her like it always had. But she wasn't thinking about the bank or the cuffs or the blood still drying in her mouth. She was thinking about the voice on the other end of the line. She was thinking about the pause before he spoke. Not confusion, not fear, but precision, control, readiness. The officer riding shotgun stretched and yawned. "Bet she's calling her son to get her lawyer cousin on the line. Probably wants to sue us for hurting her feelings," the other snorted. "Please, they don't fight, they whine. Ain't nobody coming." They both laughed. The kind of laughter that comes easily to men who've never had to earn the right to feel safe. But behind them, Evelyn remained still. Her body is small. Her presence is not. Because now the call had been made. Because now the countdown had begun. And the two men, wrapped in their ignorance, didn't know that something far more powerful than outrage had been set in motion. Something quieter. Something methodical. A storm not announced by thunder, but by the simple fact that Evelyn Brooks had asked to speak to her son. When the cruiser finally turned toward the station, one of the officers glanced into the rearview mirror again. Her expression hadn't changed. Her posture hadn't shifted. Yet something about her unsettled him now, an unfamiliar weight in her stillness, as if she were not waiting for rescue, but watching them commit their undoing. He shook the thought off. Just a tired old woman. Just another day. But Evelyn Brooks wasn't tired. She was patient. And patience, when armed with memory and truth, is the most dangerous silence in the world. Inside the precinct, fluorescent lights buzzed with indifference. The officers moved with the practiced ease of routine, nodding at colleagues, mumbling jokes beneath their breath, filing her paperwork like she was nothing but another footnote in a slow Tuesday morning. Evelyn said nothing. She didn't resist. Her silence, once interpreted as weakness, now hung between them like a sharpened wire. "Name?" a clerk asked, eyes on the screen, fingers poised over a greasy keyboard. Evelyn didn't answer. One of the officers sighed. "Evelyn Brooks," he said with a drawl, as if the name itself bored him. "Charges?" the clerk asked. "Suspicious activity. Uncooperative behavior," came the reply. Clipped and clean. No mention of bruised ribs, no mention of a stolen photo, no mention of humiliation delivered in broad daylight. Just suspicion, just deflection, just enough to hide behind. They led her to a holding bench, still cuffed, still flanked, as though 73 years of life could lunge out at any second. Her coat had gathered dust from the cruiser's floor. Her hands had gone slightly numb from lack of circulation. Still, her spine remained upright, her head unbowed, her lips pressed into a single line, had not moved since the call. She stared at the clock across the room. Tick, tick. And then something shifted, not in sound, not in light, in the atmosphere. The front doors opened again. A young officer walked in, eyes wide, moving fast. "Lieutenant Jenkins wants to see both of you, now." The two arresting officers exchanged a glance. "What for?" The kid shrugged. "Didn't say, but he looked pissed." They disappeared down the hall. Evelyn stayed seated. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The clerk looked up again, eyes flicking toward her, then toward the hallway. Something in the room began to curdle, like milk left out too long. The phone rang. Another officer picked up. His face changed, not dramatically, just enough. He lowered the phone slowly and stood. No one was laughing now. Another door opened at the far end of the room. An older officer stepped through, gray-haired, starched uniform, face carved from stone, his eyes locked on Evelyn. He didn't blink. He didn't speak. He just stared. And Evelyn stared back. No words, just recognition of someone who had underestimated the wrong mother. The hallway of the Pentagon stretched wide and cold, a cathedral of concrete and consequence. Behind closed doors, national threats were dissected, global plots unraveled, and in the still silence between briefings, power whispered through polished shoes and guarded glances. Dorian Ellis sat at the head of a long steel table, sleeves rolled with precision, not casualness. Every movement he made carried weight, the kind that didn't need to be explained or questioned. He didn't command attention. It gravitated to him. People looked when he stood. They paused when he inhaled, and when he spoke, they remembered the silence before his words more than the words themselves. The room was full. Generals with rows of ribbons across their chests, analysts flipping through encrypted tablets, and a Secretary of Defense who had interrupted a NATO call to be here. And in the middle of it, Dorian remained silent, listening, until the vibration came, not loud, not disruptive, but enough. His phone hummed once against the metal tabletop. He didn't look at it immediately. He finished the thought he was delivering, a single word on cybernetic intelligence systems, and only then did he lift the screen. The word on the screen said everything. Mom. No punctuation, no urgency, just presence. He stared at it for exactly 3 seconds. Then he stood. No explanation, no gesture, no permission sought. The chair didn't scrape. The doors didn't slam. He walked out with a calmness that turned heads more sharply than panic ever could. In the corridor, his voice was already shifting registers, low, focused. "Get me all surveillance footage from Millway National Bank, entry points, body cams, interior angles, ATM views. I want timestamps, uncut." His aide, a young intelligence officer who had survived drone briefings and night raids without blinking, fumbled. "Yes, sir, but what protocol should I use? Do we have jurisdiction?" Dorian stopped walking, turned. His gaze didn't narrow. It landed. "You don't need protocol," he said. "Use my name." The aide nodded, almost imperceptibly. "Understood." Dorian turned back, walking again. 60 minutes, nothing redacted. Another pause. Then he added, "I want every digital fingerprint that touched her file, and I want to know which badge opened that holding cell." The aide jogged off, already dialing. Before re-entering the secure control room, Dorian paused, hand on the biometric scanner. He didn't speak to the men behind the door. He spoke to the space ahead of him, to no one and everyone. "My mother doesn't need a weapon," he said, "but those men will not stand when she speaks." The door slid open with a mechanical hiss and shut behind him like a vault ceiling. Inside, the screen was already casting a glow onto the dark briefing table. Officers glanced up but didn't speak. Dorian nodded once, and that was command enough. The room adjusted around him. Files minimized, mouths closed. He didn't sit. He stood at the head, hands resting lightly on the edge of the table. "I need system access to DOJ cross servers," he said. "I'll be pulling live feeds from the Millway precinct within the hour." No one asked why. No one asked how. Because when Dorian Ellis spoke like that, voice precise, posture relaxed, tone edged in purpose, questions died before reaching the throat. He watched the screen as it split into quarters. Lobby cam, teller angle, body cam, rear hallway. The images were grainy but clear. He saw the moment she walked in. Purple sweater, head high, the pause at the counter, the wait, then Clara, then the gesture, then the face. His jaw didn't tighten. His breath didn't change. Only the smallest flicker crossed his eyes as the footage advanced, the bag yanked, the papers scattered, the hand curled around the bottle of pills. Then came the push. The frame tilted, her body struck the edge of the counter, and the blood flowed. The look. That. He didn't pause it. He didn't rewind. He watched all of it. Then, without turning his head, he said, "Make sure this feed is mirrored to the Department of Justice. I want simultaneous eyes on every agency server with jurisdiction." One of the intel analysts swallowed hard. "Sir, what exactly is the directive?" Dorian's voice stayed level. "They'll ask who authorized it. Tell them this isn't a directive." He turned, finally meeting the man's eyes. "It's a notice." There was silence, a loaded kind. Then the movement, fingers typing, screens aligning. Dorian continued, "Get me the names of every officer assigned to the Millway Bank response today. I want personnel files, disciplinary records, academic scores, and psych evals. If one of them ever cheated on a parking ticket exam, I'll know." He paced once around the room slowly. "Also, trace every media outlet flagged for the keyword Evelyn Brooks in the past 30 minutes. Someone will leak it. We don't chase leaks. We direct them." "Sir," a young comms officer began, but Dorian raised a hand. "I don't want headlines," he said. "I want exposure." The aide who had run the request returned, slightly out of breath. "Footage retrieval is complete. We got a street cam, an ATM cam, and a leaked smartphone video from a bank customer. It's trending low. No big outlets yet." Dorian nodded. "They will. In the next 4 hours, they will." He walked to the center screen again, stood before the paused frame of Evelyn on the floor. "My mother," he said softly, "survived Alabama buses, redlined housing, and hospitals that stitched wounds more slowly for women who looked like her. She's not afraid of uniforms, but that doesn't mean she should ever be expected to face them alone." He turned to the room. "This isn't about punishment. This is about recognition. What they saw was a statistic. What they touched was a legacy." His voice never rose, but every head in the room bowed, just slightly forward, as if acknowledging an oath unspoken. "Gentlemen," he said finally, "we move clean, we move fast, and we don't move with vengeance. A beat. We move with precision." A second video loaded on the screen, side angle, taken from the ATM vestibule. It showed Evelyn being pulled through the lobby, her coat dragging behind her like a banner no one dared to salute. The officer's grip on her arm, the distorted laughs, and the way no one turned to help. Dorian's eyes stayed fixed. He didn't flinch. He didn't look away. "Pause there," he said. The frame froze on her face, lips split, eyes steady, posture refusing to fold. "Now, enhance." An analyst leaned in. "Sir, resolution's limited." I said enhance. Pixels sharpened, the grain smoothed. The screen bloomed wider, centering her expression. Not pain, not fear. Dorian stepped forward, placed one hand on the table, and, eyes still on the screen, "This," he said, "is the moment everything changed." He turned not to the staff but to the room itself. His voice didn't echo. It reverberated. "You all think justice comes with flags and gavels and judges behind mahogany desks, but sometimes justice comes wrapped in wool, holding a bottle of blood pressure pills, daring you to question her humanity and survive the answer." Someone whispered, "Sir, should we notify the AG?" Dorian didn't blink. "He'll know by morning. I'll notify the country first." A silence passed through the room like static. Then the sound of fingers on keys returned, faster now. He spoke again, quietly. "Prepare a file for the Secretary of Defense. Mark it personal. not political. Include timestamps, officer reports, and omission logs. Title it, "She Called Me Son." The communications officer turned slowly in his chair. "Do you want me to draft a response statement?" "No," Dorian said. "You'll write a reminder." "What kind of reminder, sir?" "That what people do in silence echoes longer than anything ever shouted." Another pause, drafted with the tone of accountability, not an apology. "We're not sorry, we're aware." A nearby technician pulled up audio logs. "We've got internal police audio, low quality but usable. Do you want us to process or redact?" Dorian shook his head once. "Play it raw. Don't soften anything. America's gotten used to softened truths. I want them to hear the cracking edge of what happens when people with power forget what power is for." The comms room fell into quiet urgency, the kind reserved for countdowns and rescue ops. No one asked who she was anymore. They all knew. Evelyn Brooks had gone from a name in a file to an image you couldn't forget, not because of what she endured, but because of how she looked while enduring it. Dorian finally took a seat. His shoulders didn't drop. His breath didn't slow. But when he finally spoke again, it was not to anyone in particular. It was the weight hanging over the nation. She didn't call to be saved. He paused. She called to confirm they'd just made the worst mistake of their lives. The silence after his final words was not a pause. It was a command, and by the time the room exhaled, the machine had already begun to move. At 2:00 a.m. sharp, the lights inside the Millway Police Department flickered, not enough to trigger alarms, just enough to suggest that something far beyond their comprehension was entering quietly through the walls. The precinct's server room, a forgotten glass cube behind the weapons vault, blinked once. Then every console inside it began to hum in unison. A soft sound like digital breath, and then, without fanfare, began to record over itself. Across town, a black van without plates or insignias stopped outside the Millway National Bank. No one stepped out. No tools were drawn. No doors were breached. But inside the bank's digital mainframe, files that had lived dormant in unindexed storage sparked to life and began transferring themselves into secure federal cloud servers like rats fleeing a ship no one had realized was sinking. The system didn't scream. It whispered. Surveillance logs, facial recognition backlogs, transaction metadata, silent compliance with a force they didn't understand. At 2:21 a.m., a team of 6 moved silently through the basement level of the Millway precinct. They wore civilian clothes. Their badges were embedded in retina scans. Their authorization didn't require approval because it had been granted by someone the system couldn't say no to. They carried no guns, no helmets, no gloves. Only drives, silent tablets, and a language of efficiency that didn't waste syllables. One agent placed a copper-colored card reader against the central routing terminal. The light turned blue. The files began to blink. Every copy, every redundancy, backed, cloned, and sealed. At the main desk upstairs, a patrol officer frowned at his monitor. "Dispatch channel's dead," he muttered. Beside him, another tapped the body cam control feed. "Signal loss?" he asked aloud, tapping again. Nothing. The screen showed a loading icon, then static, then blackout. Panic hadn't set in. Not yet, just more dangerous confusion. In the evidence control room, 2 storage drives ejected themselves without command. When an officer tried to plug them back in, he was met with a red access denial screen stamped with an emblem he didn't recognize. Below it, 3 words flashed: "Not your jurisdiction." Somewhere inside the chief's office, a late-night report was being edited when the document disappeared mid-sentence, replaced by a blank white screen and a blinking cursor. Then, a line typed itself: "Someone's watching. Think carefully." At 3:00 a.m., the police chief's phone rang. He grabbed it, expecting a dispatch update, but heard instead the voice of an IT officer shouting down the line. "Sir, the database just encrypted itself. We can't open any of the body cam archives. Internal logs are wiped, replaced by mere files we can't access." He slammed the phone down and stormed out of his office, tie askew, shirt untucked, eyes wild. "Who authorized this?" He barked to the floor. Officers stared back blankly. He pointed to a technician. "Did you touch the camera servers?" The technician shook his head, too afraid to lie. "Then who the hell?" No one answered, because no one knew. At 3:11 a.m. in a secure facility 5 states away, Dorian Ellis stood in front of a triple monitor setup. The video loaded. There was no narration, no briefing, just the visual truth, unaltered and raw. He watched Evelyn step forward toward the counter. He watched Clara glance up, then down. He saw the flick of her wrist, the recoil of her lips, the theater of polite contempt playing out behind bulletproof glass. Then he saw the approach, the grip, the tug, the fall, and then a moment that didn't make the reports, the trembling hand reaching into the coat pocket. Not the fall, the recovery, the very next thing, the moment that didn't make the reports, the recovery, Barath recovery. He paused the video, zoomed in on the glint of the pill bottle. The light in the room was cold, fluorescent and institutional, and in that light, Evelyn's skin looked both impossibly strong and impossibly tired. "Don't touch the color," Dorian said to the tech beside him. "Let the cold stay cold." "Understood, sir." He turned, speaking without looking at anyone in particular. "Prepare a copy. Tag it with a soft watermark. Send to DOJ. Then CNN. Don't delay. Make the timestamps visible." "In the headline?" someone asked. Dorian looked at them finally. She never raised her voice. "That should be the headline." He leaned in, fingers steepled. "Let America hear what silence sounds like when it becomes proof." At exactly 3:29 a.m., a digital transfer file was completed. Its checksum verified. The master copy is safely housed in a classified Justice Department enclave. The backup delivered via encrypted fiber to 3 locations: the National Archives, a cloud node buried beneath federal jurisdiction, and a small server tagged Ellis/private. That server required only 1 retina scan to access, and it wasn't labeled with a badge number. It was protected by blood. The team dissolved as silently as it had formed. They didn't leave a trace. The chairs they'd sat in returned to their upright angles. The logs they'd generated had already been scrubbed, auto-looped through noise-canceling protocols. In the precinct, the panic had morphed into a strange inertia. Officers yelling into dead phones, rebooting terminals that blinked back like amnesiacs. No alarms, no gunfire, just silence doing exactly what it was told to do. In Dorian's facility, the monitors switched to sleep mode, one by one. He remained in the center, the screens dark around him now, but his posture unshaken. There was nothing to celebrate. This wasn't a mission accomplished. This was a mirror held up, angled downward. A junior analyst approached. "Do you want to send the footage to Internal Affairs first, sir?" "No." "Should I route it through a federal briefing channel?" "No." She hesitated. "Then who else do we notify?" Dorian's voice was softer than usual, but not weaker. "No more departments, no more meetings. Just send it to the people. Make sure it reaches every screen that matters." "You mean national media?" "No, I mean every school monitor, every city bus ad feed, every transit stop screen that flickers at midnight when no one's watching, because that's who needs to see it." He walked toward the exit, but stopped before the door. "And don't add commentary. Don't package it with music. Just the raw video. Let the silence explain itself." As he stepped out, his phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't from Evelyn. It was from an old contact, an advisor to the Attorney General. The text read, "What did you just trigger?" Dorian replied with only 2 words. "Not retaliation. Reminder." As dawn peeled back the night like old wallpaper, the data continued to travel. Servers that usually held weather maps or traffic updates now carried the quiet defiance of Evelyn Brooks. Transit screens flickered to life and played the footage on loop in near silence. No context, no opinion, just the reality. At a coffee shop in Chicago, a barista wiped down the counter as the screen above the register lit up. She froze. Customers behind her stopped mid-order. A man in a hard hat removed his earbuds. A mother held her child closer. Thousands of miles away, a janitor paused his sweeping as a wall-mount monitor displayed the same image. Evelyn's shoulders rose. Her hand reached. The fall, the blood, the pill bottle. No one spoke. The nation didn't need a narrator. At the Justice Department, a senior official finished watching it for the 5th time. He turned to his staff and said, "We won't control this, and we shouldn't." In a New York newsroom, a producer stared at the file silently before leaning over to her editor. "Schedule a segment, but don't add commentary. Let people hear it as it is." Back in Millway, police officers huddled near darkened terminals, too stunned to fabricate excuses, too quiet to cover tracks. One of them whispered, "Did we think no one would see?" The police chief sat alone in his office, replaying it on his private monitor. His face was pale, his hands still. He turned off the sound, not because it was loud, but because the quiet was unbearable. At 5:00 a.m., Dorian Ellis stepped into a briefing room, not for war, not for diplomacy, but for something far more potent: exposure. He didn't carry files. He didn't need a podium. He stood before his team and said, "They made a mistake, not because they didn't think anyone was watching, but because they didn't think what they did mattered." He paused. "Now, they'll learn what a mother's silence is worth." And with that, phase 1 was done. A storm was coming, but this one didn't thunder. It was. The silence had spread like an infection into precincts, government offices, and the hollowed-out space behind every uniform that once believed itself immune. And so, when the summons came, official, terse, unignorable, it felt less like a request and more like judgment arriving in plain clothes. Detective Harold P. Whitman and Officer Charles Rensley were ordered to report to the director's conference room at 9:00 a.m. sharp. No context, no preamble, just coordinates in a building that had once protected them, but now felt unfamiliar. The hallway leading to the room was colder than usual. Rensley noticed the AC hadn't changed. It wasn't the temperature. It was the atmosphere, like the walls themselves had been informed. The two entered. The lights were on, but not bright. No screens, no PowerPoint charts. Just a long table, a man in a gray suit sitting at the far end, and a chair pulled out for each of them, like this was dinner and they were the guests of honor. Director Gerald Krause didn't look up immediately. He held a file in one hand, pen in the other, flipping pages slowly. When he finally glanced up, his eyes didn't greet them, they measured. "Detective Whitman," he said flatly, then nodded to the other. "Officer Rensley," said they did, the chairs offering no comfort. "You've seen the footage," Krause continued. It wasn't a question. Whitman cleared his throat. "Yes, sir." "What part stood out to you?" Whitman blinked. "Sir, I'm giving you the chance to define yourself. What part of that footage stood out to you?" Whitman shifted. "She wasn't cooperative." Rensley said nothing, eyes fixed forward. Krause placed the file down. "The moment we saw was you stepping on her identification papers after she had been struck in the mouth. That was the part America saw. Was there something we missed? Something redemptive? Please, now is your moment." Whitman exhaled through his nose. "She didn't look legal." Krause slid a page across the table. A photo of Dorian Ellis in full military dress, flanked by two generals, his Medal of Honor gleaming like a reprimand. "This is her son." Whitman's voice cracked. I didn't know." Krause raised a finger. "Not knowing does not excuse. Not when you are paid to know." He stood. "Do you remember the motto on your academy wall?" Rensley spoke, finally. "To protect and serve." "Good. Then tell me, who were you protecting when you took the photograph from her purse and mocked her son's face?" Neither man answered. Krause's voice dropped. "You'll surrender your badge now." Whitman's fists clenched. "We followed procedure." The door opened without a sound. Dorian Ellis stood there, not in uniform, not in armor, but the air shifted around him as if the gravity had deepened. He walked in slowly, precise, looked at neither man. Then at Kraus. Let them finish their sentence. Kraus nodded and stepped back. Whitman stood. We followed protocol. We were told to check for fraud. She didn't act right. Dorian's voice came like a whisper across a frozen lake. What protocol says to step on a mother's identity because she didn't beg hard enough? Whitman's lip trembled. She didn't say anything. Exactly, Dorian said. She didn't scream. She didn't fight. She simply existed. And for you, that was threat enough. He placed a folder on the table. It slid neatly toward them. Inside, every citation they'd ever filed, every discretionary decision they'd claimed, a pattern, a legacy. Not knowing who she was won't save you, because now everyone else knows who you are. Whitman opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Dorian turned, walking away. He didn't slam the door. He didn't have to. The room didn't breathe for several seconds after he left. It wasn't just the shame. It was the fact that Dorian hadn't raised his voice, and yet every word felt louder than the slam of a judge's gavel. Kraus sat back down, folding his hands over the now tainted personnel files. "Gentlemen," he said, voice low, "you're no longer operatives of law enforcement, you're liabilities. You'll be processed for suspension effective immediately, and should Internal Affairs or the DOJ decide to proceed further, understand, this department will not shield you." Whitman pushed his chair back with a screech. "You're throwing us to the wolves." Kraus didn't blink. "You handed them the knife." Rensley, still seated, took off his badge and placed it on the table. Not with grace, not with regret, just mechanical surrender. A gesture that said he knew the weight it once carried had evaporated. Whitman slammed his badge down after him. All this for some woman trying to stir trouble? Kraus raised his eyes then, truly raised them, and for the first time, anger leaked past his professionalism. That woman withstood more violence in one visit to a bank than either of you ever did in your entire cushioned careers. That woman raised a man who saved more American lives than you've probably read case files. That woman didn't raise her voice once, and still she spoke louder than either of you ever will. The room was done with them. The country would be too. Outside the building, the morning had begun to bleed through the skyline. Crisp and gray, the kind of light that exposes what shadows try to hide. Dorian didn't get into a car. He walked, hands in his pockets, shoulders steady. His phone buzzed once in his coat. It was an encrypted alert. 2 resignations filed, federal review pending. He kept walking. In another corner of the city, media outlets refreshed feeds with unspoken urgency. The footage had gone viral, but the follow-up, that was where the attention crystallized. Not the violence, the response, the quiet consequence. The system reacts not with riot gear, but with razor-wire precision, names, ranks, records. By mid-morning, a trending tag emerged on social media. Badge means nothing. Beneath it, hundreds of thousands of stories poured in. Not about Evelyn specifically, but about all the moments people remembered being stepped on, without anyone ever caring. But now someone did. The officers, meanwhile, were escorted not with cuffs, but with protocol. But there was no shield anymore. No one rushed to defend them. No union statements. No PR consultants. Only the click of a security lock behind them and the knowledge that the echo of that lock was louder than any protest sign. In the afternoon, a televised segment aired, not a press conference, just a quiet shot of 2 badges laid on a dark blue cloth, beneath them the line, "Not every badge means justice." It ran for 10 seconds. No sound, no face, just that. In homes across the country, people stared. In schools, a few teachers paused their lessons to play it. In a diner outside St. Louis, an old man in a military hat saluted the screen. He didn't say why, he didn't have to. The justice wasn't loud, it was exact. Later that day, a local reporter asked Dorian, off the record, if he felt vindicated. He looked up from a mug of black coffee, eyes unreadable. "This isn't vindication," he said. "It's maintenance. I'm not interested in revenge. I'm interested in memory. I want them to remember what happens when silence is weaponized." The reporter swallowed hard. "What do you think they'll do now?" Dorian didn't smile. "They'll either learn or they'll repeat. But now, they'll do it knowing someone's watching." That evening, Director Krause signed off on a final internal memo. No dramatic announcements, no televised firings, just a line added to each personnel file in red ink. Terminated for ethical breach. Misconduct under observation. There would be no appeals, no arbitration. Not this time. The system had learned that silence could cost more than lawsuits. It could cost faith. Elsewhere in the city, Evelyn sat by a window, a thin shawl draped over her shoulders. The television was off. The phone was quiet. She held a letter in her lap. Anonymous, unsigned, with just a single sentence written in blocky script. "I saw what they did, and I will raise my children differently because of you." She read it twice, folded it once, slipped it into a box that already held medals, church programs, old photographs, and now proof that stillness, too, could shout. Back at headquarters, Krause walked the halls alone. His eyes moved over the framed plaques, commendation photos, and department slogans that suddenly felt obsolete. He stopped by the wall of honor faces of officers who'd retired after years of service. He stared, then whispered to no one, "What if honoring the wrong ones taught us how to forget the right one?" Later that night, Dorian stood alone in his apartment, overlooking a skyline too polished to tell the truth. His hands rested on the railing. No phone in hand, no mission cued, just memory. A reel that played quietly behind his eyes. The moment her ID was stepped on, the blood on her blouse, the silence she wore like armor. He didn't weep, he didn't smile. He simply whispered, "It's only just begun." And somewhere in the digital veins of the country's conscience, the truth pulsed forward. Not just about Evelyn Brooks, not just about justice, but at every moment we thought no one noticed. Now, someone always will. The air inside the National Broadcast Studio was manufactured to feel neutral, steady temperature, soft lighting. No sharp edges, but no amount of artificial calm could thaw the chill in the spines of the two men now seated behind the podium. Their suits, pressed just that morning, couldn't hide the stiffness in their posture, the dryness in their mouths. The script lay in front of them, white paper against dark mahogany, each word a nail in a box they didn't build, but now had to bury themselves inside. Detective Whitman cleared his throat. Officer Rensley didn't bother. The red light on the camera blinked once, then glowed solid. They were live. "Good evening," Whitman began, voice tight with restraint. "We come before you today to express our deep regret for the events that took place at Millway Financial on the morning of—" Rensley took over, monotone. "An unfortunate misunderstanding involving a client, Mrs. Evelyn Brooks." The phrase dropped like wet paper on concrete. Hollow, soggy, insulting. Whitman continued, eyes locked on the script. "We acknowledge that our actions may have caused distress. That was never our intent," Rensley added. "We take full responsibility for the confusion and are committed to learning from this experience." The words were perfectly arranged, perfectly empty. Behind a wall of reinforced glass, in the station's control room, Dorian Ellis sat with one leg crossed over the other. He didn't speak, didn't blink much either. His eyes were fixed on the screen, fingers drumming once, lightly, on the console beside him. When Whitman reached the line, "We take this opportunity to extend our sincerest apologies for any misunderstanding," Dorian's finger stopped tapping. He leaned forward. "Now," he said softly. The technician beside him hesitated. "Sir, cut the feed." The technician obeyed. On millions of screens, across living rooms, diners, gyms, and boardrooms, the broadcast glitched for half a breath, then resumed. But it wasn't the apology anymore. It was footage, raw, unfiltered, untouched. Evelyn Brooks bent over, hands trembling, reaching for papers, as a boot pressed lightly, then deliberately onto her ID. Another clip, her mouth bloodied, her back bowed, her eyes fixed somewhere too far away for anyone else to see. Then the image held. A single frame, frozen, Evelyn being pulled by the wrist, blood visible at her collar, her other hand clutching a bottle of heart medication. Overlaid in stark capital letters, "She's his mother." Then, cut to black. 1 second later, a still photo appeared. Dorian, uniform, decorated, eyes steady, arm wrapped around his mother. The Medal of Honor on his chest caught the light like truth catching up. No narration, no music, no commentary, just to prove. Within minutes, phones began to vibrate. In newsrooms, editors cursed, adjusted headlines. On social media, the hashtag #Shay'sHisMother rocketed from obscurity to global trend in less than an hour. People weren't just reacting, they were boiling. Because this wasn't a leak. This wasn't grainy footage or anonymous sources. This was surgical precision. This was control. This was the strategy. Back in the studio, Whitman and Rensley stared at the now blank teleprompter, the red camera light dead, the silence louder than their rehearsed apologies ever could be. A producer's voice crackled in their earpieces. "You're off air, step down." They exchanged glances, not of camaraderie, but shared confusion, the kind born of realizing too late that the room they thought was theirs had never truly been under their control. Outside, Evelyn Brooks sat in her modest living room. She didn't flinch when the image of her being pulled, blood visible, filled the screen. She didn't look away when her suffering was turned into a broadcast. She simply reached for the remote, lowered the volume, and whispered, "Now they see." At the network headquarters, executive phones rang non-stop. Anchors demanded answers, political commentators pivoted mid-broadcast. Every station that had once hesitated to use the word brutality now had it plastered across their lower thirds. On one channel, an anchor tried to soften the blow. Well, in fairness, perhaps the officers didn't know who she was. Her co-anchor, a black woman who had said nothing for most of the show, turned to her, voice cold, "You don't have to be someone's mother to..." The backlash wasn't just online. It moved through streets, passed between subway cars, slipped into conversations at lunch counters and office break rooms. A silent current surged. People were done pretending this was new. What was new was the exposure, the clarity, the deliberate cut from performance to proof. Meanwhile, in a darkened control booth, Dorian removed his earpiece. He didn't smirk, he didn't gloat. He simply turned to the technician and said, "Archive the footage. Label it public record." The technician nodded. "Yes, sir." "Make copies," Dorian added, "for DOJ, ACLU, and the Library of Congress." Then he stood, brushed invisible dust from his jacket, and left without another word. His silence now wasn't tension, it was conclusion. The strike had landed. The damage was done. But this wasn't revenge. This was architecture, a blueprint for public memory. Later that evening, in press rooms across the country, journalists parsed the meaning of what they'd witnessed. One headline read, "Apology interrupted when truth takes over the broadcast." Another, "Justice in 1080p. But the most shared came from a small independent outlet. They didn't apologize. They just got exposed. The footage was replayed, slowed, and dissected. Analysts commented on Evelyn's posture, how she never once broke. Psychologists noted the power of framing, not metaphorically but literally. "The red in her collar isn't just blood," one said. "It's a signal. It's the line that was crossed." And still, amidst the media storm, Evelyn never granted an interview. She didn't write a statement. When a reporter came to her door with flowers and a microphone, she looked him in the eye and said, "Some stories are told better without me speaking." At midnight, CNN ran the footage again, unedited, uninterrupted, introduced only by a single sentence from the anchor. "What you are about to see is the truth and nothing else." Dorian watched it alone, standing in the shadows of the Pentagon's South Corridor. His reflection ghosted against the glass window as the screen across the lobby replayed the moment of his mother's humiliation and the nation's awakening. A junior officer passed behind him, slowed, then stopped. "She's your mom," the officer said quietly. Dorian nodded once. "She didn't cry. She didn't even flinch. She didn't have to," Dorian replied. "The world did it for her." By dawn, the most liked post on the internet was a still image, no filter, no caption, of Evelyn's face as she sat on the cold bank floor, blood at her lip, eyes steady, unbowed. By noon, a new meme surfaced, a split screen. On one side, the officers are reading from their script. On the other hand, Evelyn's frozen frame. The caption, "One is acting, one is enduring." By nightfall, the bank released a statement. It wasn't an apology, it was a deflection. "We regret any distress caused by the recent incident and are reviewing procedures." It landed with all the sincerity of a robocall. No one cared. The court of public opinion had moved on to judgment. That weekend, satirists had a field day. Comedy shows mocked the apology, recreating it with sock puppets. A late-night host played the raw footage and let the silence after speak louder than any monologue. He raised a glass to the camera and said, "To mothers who don't need microphones to be heard." But not everyone laughed. In police departments across the country, internal reviews were launched. Diversity training was restructured. Recruitment campaigns quietly updated language. What once had been cosmetic now became survival. No one wanted to be the next Milway. In a small coffee shop near Fort Bragg, a woman showed the footage to her teenage son. He watched in silence, then asked, "Would you want me to speak up if I saw that happen?" She replied, "No, I'd want you to act before it ever did." And somewhere, far from cameras and hashtags, Evelyn placed a small photo of Dorian, age 6, grinning, gap-toothed, covered in mud from backyard play, into a new frame. She set it beside her window. Not the military portrait, not the headline, just the boy she'd raised, the one who knew how to fight, but more importantly, when not to. The nation didn't need another speech. It had already heard the truth, not in words, in blood, in silence, in the sudden clarity of a mother's suffering broadcast not as spectacle, but as sentence. They had tried to apologize. Instead, they testified against themselves. The broadcast had barely gone black when the tremor began, not in the streets, but in the halls of power. From the gilded ceilings of the White House to the fluorescent-lit chambers of the Department of Justice, the silence shattered like glass underfoot. The footage was too raw, too irrefutable, too damning. A mother dragged, blood streaked across her collar, and a name, Evelyn Brooks. There was no room left for ambiguity, no shield strong enough to block what was coming. By 6:30 a.m., a red-coated summons convened the Attorney General, Homeland Security, and top legal advisors inside a marble-walled crisis room. The president, pale with restrained fury, leaned into the table. "We can't let Milway dictate the tone of our democracy," he said. The room fell into a hush so deep it felt like the country itself had stopped breathing. Within the hour, the Attorney General signed an emergency declaration. All federal security grants to the Milway Police Department were suspended, effective immediately. $20 million, gone with one stroke of a pen. Not withheld, not delayed, frozen. That figure didn't just represent funding, it was a line in the sand. A sentence carved into the ledger of consequence. At that same moment, miles away in a secure defense facility, Dorian Ellis answered a secure line. The voice on the other end didn't waste words. "They want you to testify," it said. Direct address. National broadcast. There was no hesitation in Dorian's reply. "I'm not going to retaliate," he said. "I'm going to make sure my daughter never has to call me for the same reason my mother did." His voice was flat, calm, but it sliced through the line like steel. It was not the voice of a son in grief. It was the voice of a man who had seen war and still knew the deeper battlefield was built on laws, choices, and silence. Inside the Milway Police Department, the effect was immediate and merciless. Servers went into lockdown. Administrative access was frozen. Internal emails began disappearing from inboxes and reappearing as court-ordered printouts in federal review rooms. The chief's office buzzed with chaos. "Who authorized this?" bellowed Captain Reese, spit flying onto his polished nameplate, but his voice was a hollow bark inside a cage that had already been sealed. His authority was now as useful as a badge made of ice under fire. Desks were vacated without instruction. Officers, once confident in their untouchability, now moved with the jerky staccato panic of men exposed under an unflinching light. Each message they'd ever sent, each report they'd ever buried, each silent nod in the hallway, all of it now subject to federal oversight. The corridors smelled like sweat and toner. An intern fainted. A detective tried to wipe his monitor clean with shaking hand. The era of quiet complicity was over. Files that had never seen daylight began surfacing. A flood of internal communications leaked into oversight committees where cold, dispassionate eyes scanned every line with surgical precision. Memos laced with sarcasm about old ladies wasting our time now read like confessions. A casual emoji in a group chat became an indictment. Those who had once laughed in dim back rooms now scrambled to redefine what they meant. But the system had shifted. There was no off switch anymore. The national conversation shifted like a tectonic plate. Hashtags surged, editorials exploded, but it wasn't just outrage anymore. It was architecture, mobilization, restructuring. Millway, once a nameless dot on the map, became a case study in what happens when the guardians of law forget they serve the people, not their reflexes. Public trust plummeted below statistical measurability. Financial donors pulled back. State representatives withdrew support, like blood retracting from an infected wound. In the middle of this storm, Dorian stood untouched, unreadable. He issued no press statements, posted no emotional declarations, and gave no interviews. His strength wasn't in volume, it was in velocity, in precision, and though he never raised his voice, his presence had become inescapable. Like a mathematical proof written in pain, Dorian became a fact no institution could ignore. What he did say, in private rooms with high ceilings and locked doors, was recorded carefully. If justice isn't real for someone like her, he said once, then it's a theater, and I've never liked bad theater. The ripple effect was relentless. Millway's police board called for an internal review. Legal defense teams started withdrawing representation. A junior analyst in the state comptroller's office leaked a report indicating that Millway's misuse of federal grants stretched back a decade. Every layer peeled back revealed another rot, and with every exposure, the city lost another veneer of plausible innocence. Within Millway's inner circles, a saying began to emerge, an echo no one could trace to a single voice, but that passed through the ranks like gospel. Touching someone else's mother might just mean touching the motherland. It was cynical to some, prophetic to others, but no one dismissed it. Not anymore. Morale tanked, resignation spiked, and officers began showing up with visibly rewritten attitudes, not out of remorse, but out of fear that their next glance, their next breath in the wrong direction, could become evidence. Journalists camped outside City Hall. National news anchors prefaced every broadcast with the name Evelyn Brooks. And behind every screen, every microphone, every podium was the ghost of a question no one dared phrase too bluntly. What kind of country makes a mother bleed before it believes her? Meanwhile, Dorian moved with surgical clarity. He accepted the invitation to testify not out of vindication but out of obligation. My mother didn't need my help, he would later say. She needed a nation that didn't see her dignity as a question. He didn't dress like a soldier. He didn't arrive with fanfare. He wore a charcoal suit, stepped from a black car, and walked into the Capitol like a man coming to audit a debt that had accrued for centuries. No one dared interrupt him. No one dared presume his silence was absence. And though his face remained calm, the weight in his voice was a warning. This wasn't just about a mother. This was about the fragile myth of a justice system that still thought silence could pass for order. And so Millway trembled, not because of a riot, not because of a bullet, but because a mother had been wronged, and her son did not shout. He simply made the system look at itself, and the mirror was unforgiving. The silence that had once protected them now turned on them like a blade. In the echo of federal audits and televised reckonings, the hunt turned to subtler villains. Not the ones who struck first, but the ones who looked away, the bystanders, the ones whose eyes recorded everything yet whose mouths betrayed nothing. And among them, Officer Mitchell Crane stood exposed, not for what he did, but for what he didn't. He hadn't raised a fist, He hadn't shouted, he hadn't shoved. He had simply stood 3 feet away as Evelyn Brooks was humiliated, her dignity scraped against linoleum and her blood left to stain the floor unnoticed. When the push came, when her body hit the desk, when her fingers scrambled for pills, he didn't flinch. Not a word, not a wince, just the cold, glassy stare of someone who had trained himself to feel nothing. Now, in a narrow, unadorned room deep inside the Office of Internal Review, that stare was projected onto a flat-screen TV for the 3rd time that morning. The footage paused, frame by frame, until it landed on his face, still, detached, lifeless. "You didn't stop them," the ethics panelist said, without inflection. Mitchell looked tired, unshaven, lips slightly parted. "I didn't think it was my place," he replied, voice dry as paper. "I was just backup." Opposite him sat Dorian Ellis. No medals, no uniform, just the cold intensity of a man who understood the weight of silence too intimately to forgive it. His voice didn't rise, it descended, like a judgment. Silence is always the easiest choice, and also the most cowardly. He didn't blink when he said it, he didn't move, he didn't need to. The gravity of the words did all the work. Mitchell looked away, but the footage kept playing. They replayed the exact second Evelyn's hand missed the pill bottle, the shuffle of her feet, the stoop of her back, the brief, desperate search for air. On screen, Officer Crane shifted his weight, but did not bend down. He leaned against a counter. He checked the time. He did not speak. "That's the moment we're here to talk about," one panelist said. "The moment you decided that dignity was someone else's problem." Mitchell scoffed under his breath, almost too soft to catch. "So now I'm the villain because I didn't cause a scene?" he asked. There was venom in his tone, but no backbone. "You're not the villain," Dorian said quietly. "You're worse. You're the proof that good men can watch evil and convince themselves they're neutral." There was no theatricality in his delivery, only surgical precision. Each word carved away the moral camouflage Mitchell had wrapped around himself like a shield. A thin man in a navy suit, one of the civilian observers, stood up and tapped the screen. "This look," he said, pausing the footage again on Mitchell's face, "this isn't neutrality. This is a resignation. This is comfort in the face of another person's humiliation. And that's not just a failure of duty. That's a failure of humanity." Mitchell said nothing, his mouth pressed into a line, his hands curled into fists under the table, not from anger, but exposure. There was nowhere left to hide. Not behind procedure, not behind ranks, not behind the hollow justification of being just a witness. The hearing wasn't about physical violence. It was about ethical absence, about the slow rot that starts when good men decide their conscience can be outsourced. The room fell into a tense quiet. Dorian didn't move, but his presence bore down like weight. "My mother didn't need you to fight for her," he said. "She needed someone to acknowledge she was worth defending." The line wasn't emotional. It wasn't a plea. It was an indictment, a mirror held steady and mercilessly in place. The final statement came from the chair of the panel, her voice low and unsparing. "We conclude that Officer Mitchell Crane is ethically unfit to protect anyone, including justice itself." There was no gavel, no applause, just the thud of reality landing where it belonged. Mitchell didn't argue. He didn't cry out. He didn't proclaim his innocence. Instead, he reached up, unclipped the polished silver nameplate from his uniform, and set it on the table with a hand that shook. Not from fury, but from fracture. He wasn't mourning a career. He was mourning the image he once held of himself, an image now impossible to reconcile. Outside, no cameras waited for him. No reporters, no sound bites. The punishment wasn't public disgrace. It was private, lingering, and inescapable. A new kind of prison, knowing that when the test came, he had failed. Not because he acted, but because he didn't. Later, someone would say they saw him staring into a bathroom mirror in the building's lower level. Just staring, not adjusting his collar, not fixing his tie, just looking, as if trying to locate the man he thought he was, as if daring himself to recognize what was left. And that was how the silence ended. Not with a scream, not with a bang, but with the quiet crumble of a man realizing that doing nothing had always been a choice, and now, finally, it had a cost. The mirror hadn't cracked, but something inside Officer Crane had. As he disappeared into the bureaucratic shadow of his reflection, the next reckoning surfaced. Quiet, precise, and devastating in its restraint. It came not in a courtroom or through the roar of a crowd, but beneath the soft overheads of a public hearing chamber, repurposed for accountability. This time, the reckoning belonged to a woman who thought her glances meant nothing. Clara Voss, the Millway Bank employee whose eyes had done what no fingerprint could, sat centered on a long table under clean white lighting. Her posture was careful, rigid, not confident, prepared, too prepared. She had memorized an apology drafted by someone else, polished by PR hands and couched in layers of vague regret, but there was a flaw in the strategy. It assumed that the person she had wronged would play along. The door opened. Evelyn Brooks entered without a word. Her presence was like winter entering a room, a stillness so thick it bent attention toward it. She wore a dark burgundy coat that swallowed the harshness of the lighting and made the brass chair she sat on seem like it belonged to her, not the government. Her steps were deliberate, her chin steady. She carried no notes. Her memory was more than enough. Clara stood quickly. "Mrs. Brooks," she began, a practiced tremor in her voice. "I just want to say, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to disrespect you. I was just doing my job." The sentence was weak, almost antiseptic, but Evelyn didn't flinch, didn't acknowledge the attempt. Instead, she took her seat across from Clara and waited until the room had sunk into silence. "When I handed you my documents," Evelyn said, her voice clear but not loud, "you didn't look at the forms. You looked at me." Her words weren't accusatory, they were anatomical, like a surgeon naming a bone. "And what I saw in your eyes wasn't suspicion, it was contempt. Cold, casual, certain." Clara blinked. "That's not fair," she said. Her voice had climbed an octave, defensiveness dressed as disbelief. "I didn't mean it like that. I wasn't trying to be cruel." Evelyn turned her head slightly. "Cruelty doesn't require intention," she replied. "It only requires ease. And you," she leaned in, just enough, "you did it effortlessly." The chamber fell into a deep involuntary stillness. The mayor sat frozen. A local journalist forgot to hit record. Clara opened her mouth again but said nothing. Her fingers twisted nervously in her lap. Dorian stepped forward from the back of the room, silent until that moment. His steps were clean, measured. He didn't command attention, he disrupted it quietly, profoundly. He stood next to his mother and placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. Then he faced Clara, whose eyes were now swimming. "You didn't drop her documents that day," he said. "You dropped your sense of decency. That's harder to pick up." Clara's hands trembled. She let out a shaky breath. "I swear, I didn't mean to humiliate her. I was under pressure. It was policy. There's a checklist." She stopped when she realized no one was nodding. "It's not personal." Evelyn raised a single eyebrow. "If it wasn't personal, why did it feel like it had everything to do with my person?" Her voice wasn't angry. It was weighted, each syllable laid down like a brick. "What you did that day wasn't about banking. It was about hierarchy. You thought I was beneath the threshold of your respect." Clara's body began to fold in on itself. Her composure, which had barely held for 10 minutes, collapsed. She started to cry. It wasn't performative. It wasn't rehearsed. It was the messy, uncomfortable kind. The cry of a person realizing too late that their self-prestige was a lie. She stood up. Sorry," she said, voice cracking. "I'm so sorry. Please, I'll say it 1,000 times." Evelyn didn't move. "Don't say it to me," she said. "Say it to the first black child who walks up to your counter and sees your hesitation. Say it to the young mother you second-guess because her English has an accent. Say it to the quiet man who signs a mortgage form while you judge his clothes. You don't owe me anything. You owe them everything." The room erupted, not in applause but in transformation. People didn't cheer. They sat straighter. They blinked longer. They breathed quietly. Something had shifted, not just in Clara, but in everyone who had ever believed that neutrality was harmless. Dorian didn't speak again. He didn't need to. His silence was a scaffold. Evelyn could build a truth. When he helped her up from the chair, he did so without flourish. She stood, smoothed her coat, and turned her back to the podium, as if it had never belonged to anyone but her. Clara knelt. The cameras didn't zoom in. No one twitted. No statement was issued. She didn't kneel to be forgiven. She knelt because she couldn't stand anymore, not under the weight of everything unspoken she now heard too clearly. Outside, the sun had shifted behind the clouds. Evelyn walked slowly, flanked by her son. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. Their silence, like their presence, was full, and behind them the city exhaled, just slightly changed. That was the price of contempt. Not a confrontation, not a scandal, not even shame. It was the truth, spoken in the tone of a whisper that left no part of you untouched. The door closed behind Evelyn Brooks with the quiet authority of a gavel. Outside, no one shouted, no protests rang, no sirens blared. Yet the silence that followed her departure struck louder than any verdict ever issued in a courtroom. And in the echo of that silence, the country began to measure its values not through speeches, but through spreadsheets. At precisely 9:02 a.m. the next morning, the President of the United States signed Executive Order 307, the immediate suspension and indefinite freezing of all federal security grants directed to the city of Millway, $20 million in funding. Erased with a pen stroke. The press release that followed was surgical in tone, yet thunderous in implication. The federal government cannot invest in the safety of a place that cannot recognize a citizen's right to exist without suspicion, it read. Security that humiliates is not security. It is failure wearing a badge. By noon, the city's budget office had gone into freefall. Phone lines blinked red. Department heads whispered curses between gritted teeth. The chief of police, pale and tight-jawed, stood before a podium flanked not by flags, but by resignation. "We are reviewing our allocations," he muttered, a euphemism for a fiscal autopsy. One unit would lose its fleet, another, its overtime. Requests for riot gear were left unanswered. Federal liaisons vanished overnight. Tactical operations went dark, not out of discipline, but desperation. Behind closed doors, the mayor of Millway convened an emergency council. His voice, once booming with confidence, now slithered through excuses like a man drowning in his defense. "This is political overcorrection," he spat. "We're being penalized for optics, not outcomes." But the council chamber smelled of sweat, toner, and fear. Because this wasn't about one bad officer. This was about systemic apathy. About the cost of watching a woman bleed and calling it a glitch in the process. No longer insulated by municipal privilege, the Millway Police Department faced its reflection. The numbers spoke louder than any denial. A 38% reduction in tactical support. A 52% cut in discretionary funds. Several training programs, once praised in glossy annual reports, have now folded like paper shields. And above it all loomed the shadow of Evelyn Brooks, not as a martyr, but as a ledger entry that couldn't be erased. That afternoon, a closed-door press conference was held at the federal building. No fanfare, no anthem, just a line of officials in tailored suits and stony expressions. And standing among them, Dorian Ellis. No applause greeted him, no chants, just stillness, as though the walls themselves understood who had entered. He approached the podium with no prepared speech, no PR handler, no dramatic pause. Just truth, clean and uncut. "I don't need you to pay my mother back," he said. The microphone caught every syllable like it was gospel. "I need you to pay forward the dignity you withheld. I don't want compensation. I want recalibration. I want to know that a black child born in Millway tomorrow won't have to memorize how to survive a traffic stop before they learn algebra." His voice didn't crack, it carved. The room didn't breathe. His words weren't political. They weren't poetic, they were infrastructural. Blueprints of a better republic, written not in slogans, but in the syntax of justice. Dorian didn't smile when he stepped back. He simply nodded once, as if placing a final signature on a document no one could refuse. In the following days, the effect cascaded. Community initiatives, once dependent on federal police partnership, dissolved. Vendors canceled contracts. A regional police symposium removed Millway from its speaking docket. National newspapers ran headlines not about the city's crime rate, but about its moral rate and how low it had dipped before anyone noticed. City officials scrambled to save face. They offered late reforms, public apologies, diversity hires, and panel reviews. But nothing stuck, because the trust had evaporated, because the harm had a timestamp, because Evelyn Brooks had become more than a case. She was now currency, the kind no city could counterfeit. And the real blow wasn't to the budget, it was to the narrative. For decades, Millway had positioned itself as a model for balanced policing. Not anymore. Its name now rhymes with exposure, with accountability, with the sudden and unforgiving loss of $20 million. Not just as money, but as meaning, a message, a reckoning. What made the blow so absolute was its restraint. No thanks. No marches, no fire, just the freeze of a checkbook and the heat of a mother's silence. No city seal could shield them from that. No memo could reframe what the footage had already revealed. And in homes across America, parents looked at their children, not with fear, but with memory, of what Evelyn endured, of what Dorian refused to normalize, and of the quiet courage it takes to demand transformation not with violence, but with unwavering clarity. Millway hadn't just lost funding, it had lost the benefit of the doubt. And in doing so, it became something rare, a case study in what happens when indifference is finally taxed. And justice, when it finally comes with a receipt, doesn't just balance the books, it rewrites them. The freeze had landed like a hammer without sound, cracking not just Millway's funding but its self-image, and in the wake of that silent rupture, America watched, not out of curiosity but necessity. Something had shifted, something irreversible. It was no longer about whether the system was flawed, it was about what kind of voice could be trusted to say it aloud. The network set was pristine, every camera calibrated, every light adjusted to soften the edges of tension. The studio was silent except for the faint hum of broadcast monitors. And seated center stage, beneath the gleam of primetime scrutiny, was Dorian Ellis. He didn't wear his medals. He wore charcoal gray. No lapel pins, no theatrics. Just presence, dense, unmoving. Across from him, the host, seasoned media figure known for towing the line between candor and comfort, cleared his throat. The question had been prepared, revised, and softened by legal and PR filters, but when it came out, it still hit like a cracked bell. Mr. Ellis, do you believe the police were wrong? Dorian didn't shift in his seat. He didn't blink. He let the silence draw itself long enough for the question to feel uncomfortable in the room that asked it. Then, in a voice smooth but flint-edged, he said, "How wrong does something have to be before we're allowed to call it wrong?" The audience held its breath. The host hesitated, as though waiting for elaboration, but Dorian offered none. Not yet. He sat with it, let the question echo in their minds. And then, calmly, he continued, "I've pulled American citizens out of terrorist camps. I've stepped into gunfire for strangers, because my oath meant something. But when my mother was pushed to the floor in a place she trusted with her identity, no one raised a hand, no one raised a voice. She was treated like trash. And I'm still..." He didn't cry. His voice didn't break. But his eyes, that stillness in them, burned through every lens in the studio. The host swallowed, clearly rattled. He glanced at his notes, searching for the next card, the next pivot. But there was no pivot. There was only weight, gravity, and the camera, unwilling to cut away, stayed on Dorian's face, as if daring anyone to look away first. "Do you think this is systemic?" the host asked, more softly now. "Do you think this goes beyond Millway?" Dorian looked directly at him. "Does it matter what I think?" he asked. "You've seen the footage. You've heard the justifications. You've read the press releases. The only question that matters now is, what are you still pretending not to see?" A pause followed, long enough to feel like judgment. The audience was still, the studio frozen. Every viewer at home leaned just slightly forward, not to hear better, but to brace for the next word. "I'm tired of explaining pain," Dorian said. "I'm tired of translating it into something palatable for people who think accountability is the enemy of order. My mother bled, and people took notes on the tone of my voice instead of the stain on her blouse." There were no applause signs in the studio, but someone in the third row stood up anyway. A middle-aged black woman, hand to her chest, whispered, "We see you." Another man stood, then another, until a third of the audience was upright, not cheering, just bearing witness. And in that hush, from the back, a voice rang out, raw, cracking. "You're not alone." Dorian's face didn't change. He gave no nod of gratitude, no wave, but his eyes closed for a second. Just one, enough to register the weight of being seen, not as a hero, but as a man unwilling to lie anymore. The host tried to bring the segment to a close. "Well, thank you, Mr. Ellis. That was powerful." Dorian turned to him one last time. Power isn't saying something loud. It's saying something true and still being heard. Then he stood, without waiting for dismissal, and walked off the set. That night, the broadcast shattered viewership records. Not because it was dramatic, but it was precise. The country didn't want to be entertained, it was to be confronted. And no one could say they didn't understand anymore, because Dorian hadn't yelled, he hadn't cursed, he hadn't begged, he had spoken in verdicts, and the world for once listened. The cameras faded to black after Dorian's final words, but the tremor in the system didn't stop with the broadcast. It rolled like thunder through administrative offices, police precincts, political inboxes and boardrooms. The sound wasn't loud, but it was final. There was no longer any room to hide behind protocol or polish, and at the center of the fallout stood a man who had built his career on managing silence. Richard Colburn, Chief of Police of Millway, sat in the high-backed leather chair at the end of the long oak conference table. The emblem of the department loomed behind him on the wall, but its presence now felt more like an indictment than authority. He had been a man of structure, of reports, of chain-of-command defenses. His press conferences had always been stiff, peppered with coded language and circular logic, but this wasn't a press conference. This was the final meeting before his resignation would be made public. The tone in the room wasn't hostile. It was colder, professional, surgical, the way systems behave when they prepare to remove something they can no longer defend. His voice, when it came, was tired, but still carried that clipped, practiced sharpness. "I was not present at the bank during the incident," he said. His hands were clasped, his eyes were not. They wandered over the faces of men and women who had once taken notes when he spoke, now merely watching him fall. "Decisions were made at lower levels," he added. "My role is strategic, not operational." That's when a voice interrupted him. It didn't come from an activist or a journalist or a prosecutor. It came from someone who had sat 3 doors down the hall for 20 years. An older man, his badge already removed, leaned forward with nothing to lose. "But you were in the right position to change it," he said, "and you didn't." The room went still. Not dramatically, not performatively. It was a silence of finality, the kind that arrives not with fists, but with facts. Richard's face didn't contort in anger. It barely moved. That was the problem. He had built an empire on control, on measured neutrality, on distance, and now that very distance stood trial. Because it wasn't rage or recklessness that had sunk Millway, it was precisely the kind of composed detachment that lets rot fester unnoticed. He opened his mouth to speak, but no one leaned in. No one waited to be convinced. A junior analyst near the wall slid a folded document toward the center of the table. The resignation letter. Not drafted for him. Drafted by legal. Pre-written. Sanitized. It was just waiting for his signature. Outside, the building's marble steps were surrounded by quiet media. No chants. No anger. Just reporters with sharpened pens and public memory. They didn't need a scandal. They had a sequence. They had silence. Richard picked up the pen. For a second, he stared at the paper, as if waiting for history to forgive him. It didn't. He signed. The statement released an hour later was cold and clinical. Effective immediately, Chief Richard Colburn has stepped down from his position to allow new leadership during a transitional period. But the public already had its headline, written in sharper ink. It didn't need adjectives, it had timing. The man who stood for nothing stepped down when standing mattered most. In editorial rooms, analysts called it a moral resignation, not because Richard Colburn was a monster, but because he wasn't. He was something far more dangerous. A leader too measured to lead, too neutral to choose a side, too professional to take a stand. And when history looked for villains, it wouldn't find him frothing with hatred or power. It would find him seated in a boardroom, composed, while the dignity of others was trampled in silence. He didn't lose his job because of a decision he made. He lost it because of the decisions he avoided. And in that avoidance, a generation saw exactly what happens when leadership forgets who it serves. There was no applause when he left the building, no shouting, just the sound of footsteps walking into a future where his name would be remembered, not with rage, but with resignation. The echo of footsteps faded, and with it, the last remnant of Richard Colburn's authority. But the reckoning didn't end at the edge of his resignation. It lingered deeper, quieter, in the spaces where wounds don't bleed, where bruises outlast cameras, and where the most lasting pain is not felt on the skin, but in the silence between generations. That's where Evelyn Brooks was headed now. Not to the podium, not to the headlines, but to a hospital room lit with sterile peace and unwanted memory. The nurse walked ahead, clipboard in hand, glancing over her shoulder every few seconds as if to confirm that the woman behind her was real. Evelyn moved slowly, deliberately, her hands clasped in front of her as though holding a truth too heavy to place elsewhere. There was no weakness in her pace, only weight. The door opened. The doctor smiled gently, too gently, with that measured compassion trained into people who know they cannot fix what they are about to examine. He motioned for her to sit. She did. No complaint, no grimace, just a quiet breath as she rolled up the sleeve of her coat, revealing the bruise. It had aged into a deep marbled purple, threading through her arm like a secret map of what had happened. The doctor hesitated before asking, "Does it hurt?" She smiled, but it wasn't with warmth. It was with clarity, the kind that made the question itself feel smaller than it should have been. "Not as much," she said, "as the eyes of the little black children I've seen watching the video." She looked straight ahead as she spoke. They weren't surprised, just familiar, and I don't want them to get comfortable with this. The room went still, not out of respect, out of recognition, because the injury was no longer a matter of swelling or skin. It was a statement. It was a generational scar. Out in the hallway, Dorian stood like a monument, unmoving, suited, silent. He hadn't entered the room with her. He hadn't hovered. He had only watched through the small glass window in the door. This time, it wasn't out of protocol. It was reverence, because this wasn't a moment for protection. It was a moment to witness. And then, something rare happened. He bowed his head, slowly. Not as a habit, not as a performance, but with intention and weight and something that resembled mourning. His right hand moved up, deliberately, across his chest, not in salute to a flag or to the uniform he once wore, but to the woman in that room, his mother, the one who had endured the assault, the silence, the spotlight, and still sat upright, not demanding justice, but embodying it. The gesture was silent, but its meaning echoed louder than any speech. He wasn't honoring a country. He was honoring the reason he still believed one might someday be worthy of her. Inside, Evelyn's eyes flicked to the window and caught it. She didn't wave, She didn't smile, but the corners of her mouth shifted just enough to say everything. She had seen her son do many things: lead, fight, defend, endure, but this was the first time she'd seen him kneel in spirit. The doctor finished the exam, his voice softened by more than professionalism now. "We'll monitor it," he said, "but the bruising will fade." Evelyn nodded once. "Some bruises do," she replied. "Others, they teach." There were no more questions, no more explanations, just the quiet space between a wound and the world that created it. Evelyn stood, adjusted her coat, and walked out on her own. Dorian didn't reach for her. He simply fell in step beside her, shoulder to shoulder, as if both of them knew there was no comfort in what came next, only resolve. The hallway felt longer than it was, not because of its length, but because of what had just taken place inside. A moment that wasn't designed for history books or headlines. It was smaller, but it carried farther, because there is a kind of pain that does not demand vengeance. It demands memory. It does not shout, it stays. And in that silence, something unshakable was passed between them. Not grief, not bitterness, but a vow, a quiet, generational promise that no child watching those videos should ever have to think, "That's normal, not ever again." The silence that had followed Evelyn Brooks through the hospital hallway did not stay behind. It moved, like her presence, with quiet purpose and deeper weight. It moved through cable news anchors forced to speak her name with reverence, not ratings. It moved through schoolyards, through barber shops, through dinner tables and Senate floors. But above all, it moved through one particular institution in Louisiana, an old state university where names on buildings had always belonged to men who wielded weapons, who led battalions, who wore ribbons for decisions made far from consequence, until now. At the end of a cobbled path across a manicured lawn browned slightly by winter stood the largest auditorium of the campus. It had once been called Jefferson Military Hall in honor of a long-dead general. Few students remembered and none revered, but that name, heavy in a different way, had begun to itch. When the footage of Evelyn's arrest reached the student body, it didn't cause riots. It caused reflection. In classrooms, in dorm rooms, in long campus nights filled with late coffee and early questions. Why did so many buildings still honor silence? Why hadn't they honored survival? A petition started in a humanities class, made its way through the student senate within 4 days. By week 2, it had over 9,000 signatures. Some alumni pushed back, of course. They used words like tradition, like legacy, like historical significance. But those words rang hollow against the sound of a 73-year-old woman being slammed against a bank desk for daring to collect what she had earned. In a vote that would make national headlines, the Board of Trustees made it unanimous. The hall would be renamed. The day of the unveiling arrived under a slate-colored sky that threatened rain but never delivered. The ceremony was modest by design. No celebrity guest speakers, no political overtures. Just a stage, a lectern. A drape hangs over the new plaque. And Evelyn. Dorian stood beside her in the front row, his posture as still as a salute, though his uniform had long been replaced by something heavier, restraint. He had been asked to speak, repeatedly, kindly, but he declined each time. "This day," he said, "isn't mine." Evelyn said nothing during the preamble. She listened as the university president offered a carefully crafted tribute, filled with phrases like moral clarity and civil courage. She waited as a student leader, a young black woman with nerves pulsing through her hands, read from the resolution that passed the renaming. And then came the moment. The drape dropped. Evelyn Brooks Hall. Because justice needs no gun. The words were stark, sharp, and unadorned. They carved through the air like a verdict no one could appeal. The president motioned toward Evelyn to come forward. She didn't hesitate. She didn't rush. She walked with the same grace that had taken her into the bank that winter morning, the same grace that had let her survive it without apology. She reached the microphone, took it in her hand, and paused. She didn't clear her throat, she didn't shuffle her papers, she just looked at the crowd, then past them toward the building, and then back again. "If honor has a price," she said, "then those who once made me bow should now learn to bow to what's right. No more, no less." Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Her words did not invite applause. They demanded it. And yet, what followed was not applause, but an eruption of silence so profound that it rang louder than clapping ever could. It was the stillness of realization, the sharp inhale of a generation catching its breath. And then, slowly, one by one, the people stood. They did not cheer, they rose. All of them, students, deans, trustees, groundskeepers, parents, alumni. Some with tears they didn't wipe, some with hands folded tight. Some simply stood like it was the only thing their bodies could do under the weight of her words. Dorian remained still, eyes forward, his chin set with pride. He didn't look at her, not yet. He just let the moment belong to her fully. And when she turned, walking back down the steps of the stage, her cane tapping lightly against each riser, she passed him with only the smallest nod, a nod that said, "This is what we protect." A reporter in the back scribbled notes. A photographer took dozens of photos, but none captured the weight of the space. Only the janitor, a man who had cleaned Jefferson Hall for 33 years and had always walked around its name with a quiet curse, summed it up as he passed by the new plaque. They finally put the right name on the wall. What had once been a tribute to war was now a monument to endurance. What had once glorified might now testify to dignity. There was no post-ceremony interview with Evelyn, no press release from her family. She didn't stay for refreshments. She didn't wave like royalty. She simply walked away from the podium, down the steps, through the grass, past the cameras, back into history. Not as a footnote, but as a foundation. That evening, the hall hosted its first event under the new name, a student-led panel on racial equity and justice. The chairs were full. The stage was lit. No one mentioned the previous name. It didn't deserve remembrance, because now, carved in black steel, visible from every corner of the campus square, stood a reminder. You don't need medals or weapons to shape a nation. Sometimes, you only need to stand. The echo of Evelyn's words hadn't yet faded from the stone walls of the newly christened hall when another voice, quieter but cutting sharper, pierced the conscience of a nation. That voice belonged to Dorian Ellis, and though he didn't raise it, the world still held its breath to hear him. The hearing was scheduled for a Wednesday morning, beneath the stately rotunda of the Capitol, in a room saturated with both history and hubris. It was part of a broader investigation into systemic misconduct in law enforcement, a proceeding that for years had been ceremonial at best, ignored at worst. But this time, the cameras were not just rolling, they were waiting. Dorian arrived without a team, without a speechwriter, without even a tie. His blazer was navy, his shirt was crisp, and his silence, as he took his seat before the congressional panel, was louder than the opening gavel. The chair called for statements. Dorian looked up. "I won't waste your time," he began, "because my mother didn't waste hers when they dragged her across a bank floor for daring to exist." The room fell still. "I've served in Afghanistan," he continued, "in jungles so thick you couldn't see your enemy until they were on top of you. But the most dangerous place I've ever known isn't halfway around the world. It's the neighborhood where my mother was humiliated for being the wrong color with the wrong name in the wrong zip code." A ripple passed through the audience. Not shock, but recognition. One senator, gray-suited and prematurely irritated, interrupted. "Mr. Ellis, we understand this was deeply personal, but with all due respect, this is a policy hearing, not a place for emotional catharsis." Dorian didn't blink. He didn't flinch. He leaned forward, his voice even. "My mother isn't emotional. She's evidence." A silence detonated in the chamber, the kind of silence that only follows when a truth lands too cleanly to argue with, too raw to escape. A clip of that exchange would be viewed more than 300 million times in the months to follow. It would be translated, subtitled, remixed, broadcast, and studied. It would be shared in classrooms and courtrooms, reposted by celebrities and strangers, played on loop in the background of protest marches and Sunday sermons, because it didn't just indict a system, it exposed it. Dorian said little else during the hearing. He answered questions calmly, precisely. When asked what he believed should change in law enforcement, he replied, "I don't want reform that makes things look better. I want a policy that makes it impossible for a man to stand by while a woman is made small. No slogans, no campaigns, just facts, framed in dignity." Later, when the session recessed, a staffer for the committee chair whispered, "We just witnessed a doctrine." That afternoon, the video of Dorian's statement began its ascent, at first shared by activists and civil rights groups, then by lawmakers, then by sports figures, musicians, and CEOs. It didn't trend, it dominated. Within 48 hours, it was labeled the most important speech since Selma, but Dorian never called it a speech. He called it what it was, testimony. That word mattered, because in a world so addicted to performance, testimony meant something else. It meant the speaker didn't need you to agree. He only needed you to understand that it happened, and understanding this time was unavoidable. When the clip of Dorian's testimony still pulsed through every corner of the internet, when another kind of record began writing itself, not in courtrooms or press conferences, but in the hearts of those who had been watching in silence for too long. While policy debates swirled and pundits scrambled to analyze his words, filmmakers moved quietly, carefully, with reverence and restraint. They weren't after a headline. They were documenting history. The film was titled The Mother Without a Flag. It didn't open with music or narration. No swelling orchestra, no patriotic montage, just silence. Then grainy footage. A frame frozen in time. Evelyn Brooks standing in line at the bank, her fingers gripping a small folder like it held the weight of her entire existence. It did. Across 90 minutes, the film traced not just the incident at Millway Bank, but the decades that built toward it. It moved through red-lined neighborhoods and segregated classrooms, through voter suppression laws and the polite cruelty of systemic bias. But always, always, it returned to Evelyn, not as a symbol, as a woman, a mother, a citizen who had never once asked for a pedestal, only a place to stand. It showed how her silence in the bank was never passive. It was generational. It was the silence of someone who had seen more injustice than she could name and still chose dignity over violence. It revealed how that silence carried not surrender, but a deep, old kind of power, the kind that doesn't flinch in the face of insult, because it has survived worse than insult. In the final scene, the camera lingered on Evelyn at her kitchen table. There were no lights, no makeup, no teleprompters, just her hands, weathered but steady, opening a letter written in pencil on wide-ruled paper. She adjusted her glasses. Her eyes moved slowly across the page. Then her voice, soft, still unmistakably resolute, began to read. "Dear Mrs. Brooks," it said, "my name is Layla. I'm in 3rd grade. I saw the video of you in the bank. My mom said what they did was wrong. I didn't understand at first, but then we talked. I thought I had to be quiet when people said mean things to me at school, but now I want to talk back. I want to be brave, because you showed me I don't have to make myself small so they can feel big." Evelyn's fingers tightened around the letter. Her lips trembled. Then, for the first time since that winter morning at Millway, her tears came. Not from pain, not from rage, but from a flood she had kept behind a dam of survival for too long. She wept like someone who had waited a lifetime to be seen, and finally was. Dorian stepped into the frame. No medals, no salutes, just a son standing behind his mother. He placed one hand gently on her shoulder, then whispered, "You won, Mom. Not because I'm a soldier, because you're a mother." The screen faded to black. No credits rolled. Just one line appeared. She never asked for a flag. She asked for a future. The documentary would go on to win awards, to be taught in schools, and to be archived in the Library of Congress. But its power had nothing to do with accolades. It was a mirror and a reminder that justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it arrives quietly, with a folded letter and a voice that dares to speak even when the world tells it to be still. The stillness that followed the release of the mother without a flag wasn't silence. It was a pause so deep it shook institutions. People didn't just applaud, they questioned, they changed. And in that rare moment when a country listens with its heart instead of its headlines, the White House responded. A formal invitation was sent to the Brooks family. The president, in an unprecedented move, had authorized the Medal of Civil Honor, the highest civilian distinction, to be awarded to Evelyn Brooks and her son, Dorian Ellis. The letter came embossed with gold trim, signed with a ceremonial flourish, sealed with the dignity of tradition. But tradition had already been pierced. The world had already witnessed what needed to be honored, and when the time came to accept, Evelyn and Dorian declined. The moment the letter reached Dorian's hands, there was no pause, no meeting, no weighing of pros and cons. He sat down at his desk, pulled a sheet of paper from the drawer, and began to write. Each word struck like a chisel, carving into stone. "My mother does not need a medal," it began. "She needs a country where a mother does not have to call her son just to be treated as human." No preamble, no thanks, no deflection. He continued, "To honor her with medal, while millions of mothers like her remain unseen, unheard, and unprotected, would not be tribute. It would be theater." The language was spare, but every line burned. We do not seek recognition for enduring what should never have happened. We seek the end of the reason it happened. And then the line that would freeze the nation mid-scroll, mid-sentence, mid-denial: "Give your medals to the next mother," forced to kneel in front of a badge to keep her dignity. He signed the letter not as a war hero, not as a victim, simply Dorian Ellis, son. The Washington Post printed the full letter on its front page the next morning. No headlines, just the text in clean black serif against a sea of white. It was the quietest page in the paper's history, and the loudest. Commentators didn't know how to respond. Politicians, long accustomed to wrapping failure in ribbons, now stood naked before a nation, asking the one question that could not be dodged. What kind of honor is it if it arrives after humiliation? That week, debates didn't spiral into noise. They sank into reflection. Editorials titled, "The Honor We Never Earned," "When a Medal Feels Like Silence," and "This is the Letter We Should Have Written First," filled column after column. In classrooms, teachers replaced textbook assignments with discussions on the meaning of dignity, not as a concept, but as currency, how it's withheld, negotiated, sometimes weaponized. In law schools, Dorian's letter was analyzed not for legal strategy but for moral clarity. Even within the military, circles of soldiers gathered in silence, reading each line of the letter aloud, not out of ritual, but reverence. And somewhere, in a modest home far from the marble floors of Washington, Evelyn sat by the window, watching her garden bloom. She hadn't asked her son to refuse. She hadn't needed to. Her values had always spoken louder than medals. When a reporter asked later if she regretted turning down the nation's highest civilian honor, she smiled, slow and certain, and replied, "My son is the highest honor I'll ever need." The story didn't go viral because it was dramatic. It went viral because it was true. Because, for once, someone had refused the stage, and in doing so, owned the spotlight. Because a mother who had said nothing in a bank had now spoken through a nation's conscience. And because, for the first time in a long time, America wasn't being told what justice looked like. It was being shown what it could no longer ignore. The ink hadn't dried on the front page of the Washington Post when its words began echoing far beyond political circles or federal chambers. In Millway, inside a modest brick building marked Public School District 12, truth entered through a screen rather than a textbook. It was supposed to be just another lecture on civil liberties, the kind that students half listened to while doodling in notebooks or waiting for lunch. But that morning, Mrs. Calloway, a history teacher with 22 years of cautious neutrality, walked into her class holding a flash drive like it carried a live wire. Without introduction, she plugged it in, clicked play, and stepped aside. The room darkened. The projector blinked. Silence took the floor. On screen, Evelyn Brooks appeared. Not in medals, not in myth, but in vulnerability. The clip didn't roar, it whispered. It showed her being seized, her hand clutching a bottle of heart medication as she was dragged out of a bank lobby by officers twice her size. No one in the room moved. Not when she fell, not when she bled. Not even when one officer planted his foot on her scattered documents. A stillness hung in the air, the kind that doesn't ask for attention but demands it. The students, aged 16 to 18, sat frozen. The footage ended. No one exhaled. And then a chair scraped. Jalen Thompson, 17, quiet, the type who rarely raised his hand, stood up. His voice was calm, but it carried weight like steel under silk. "If that was my grandma," he said, "I don't think I could forgive them. But I ain't here to talk about forgiveness. I just want her to know we saw it, and we see her now." No applause, no gasps, just gravity. What happened next wasn't rehearsed, and wasn't instructed. One by one, students rose, not in protest, but in posture. They didn't chant, they didn't riot. They reached for pens. Sheets of notebook paper turned into canvases, desks became desks again, only this time for something that mattered. The letters were not graded, not corrected for grammar. They were written from the marrow. "Dear Mrs. Brooks," one read, "you don't know me, but now I can't forget you." Another said, "You made it through that day without yelling. I've been angry for less. You taught me what real strength looks like." One girl, Maya, handed in her note with trembling hands. Hers ended with, "I used to think staying quiet was mature, but now I think quiet is just safe for people who already feel heard." But it was Malik Johnson's letter that the teacher read aloud the next morning, voice cracking despite her practiced restraint. His handwriting was rough, his lines weren't straight, but his words cut clean. "You don't need America to apologize," he wrote. "America needs you to remind it what humanity looks like." The letter had circled the country, folded into classrooms, taped to police station walls, whispered between generations who rarely shared the same kind of silence. Malik's words, raw, adolescent, unpolished, were quoted in forums, etched into murals, printed on protest placards without needing edits. But while words carried fire, it was an image that delivered the final judgment. Inside the United States Capitol, past security checkpoints and under domes lined with the faces of founding fathers, a new photograph was hung without ceremony. It wasn't framed in gold, nor placed behind velvet ropes. It didn't announce itself, didn't demand adoration. It simply existed, black and white, grainy, still. It showed Evelyn Brooks in the moment America had failed her most completely. Her left hand was clenched around her medication bottle like a life buoy. Her right arm, caught mid-pull by two uniformed officers, hung not in resistance but in quiet survival. Her face, neither contorted by rage nor frozen in fear, was a sculpture of dignity against the pressure of state power. No caption, no plaque, no headline, just raw, undeclared truth suspended in time. For the staff who passed it daily, it became more than decor. Senators, lobbyists, aides, all slowed as they approached. Footsteps, faltering not because of protocol, but because the image pierced past policy. It bypassed intellect. It spoke directly to conscience. Some glanced away quickly, others lingered. A few pretended not to see it, as if turning their heads could turn back the moment, but it was there, unavoidable, unblinking. One morning, as sunlight from the rotunda spilled across the marble floor, a boy walked in, holding his father's hand. Wide-eyed, maybe 7 or 8, he paused in front of the image. He looked up at it, looked, and tugged at his father's sleeve. "Who is she?" the boy asked. The man, in no rush to answer, bent to his son's level. His voice was low, steady. "She's someone this country owes a bow to." The boy didn't ask for more. He only nodded, the way children do when they understand something without needing words for it, and then they moved on, but the image stayed behind, doing what no law, no speech, no statute ever had. That photograph didn't scream, it didn't explain, it didn't forgive, it didn't forget. It simply bore witness. In the weeks that followed, that image was replicated not as posters but in hearts. Young leaders printed it in student newspapers. Social workers printed it on folders carried into courtrooms. An artist in Oakland painted it 20 feet tall on the side of a church with the words "Define Justice Again." No one sued, no one claimed copyright, because no one owned it. Evelyn Brooks had become public memory, but Evelyn herself never asked to be. She never stood under her mural. She never posted the photograph. When asked about it during an interview months later, she smiled faintly and said, "I didn't pose for it. I was just standing my ground in someone else's storm." Dorian never commented on the photo. He didn't need to. His actions had already built their frame, and for the first time in decades, it wasn't a gun or a lawsuit or a riot that shifted the ground under American power. It was an old woman's refusal to flinch, frozen forever in monochrome. And so, without demanding retribution, without uttering a slogan, without burning anything down, Evelyn Brooks redefined the battlefield. She proved that justice didn't always shout. Sometimes it stood quietly, holding a bottle of pills, daring the world not to look away, and the world didn't.